read that cover to cover, and I transcribed it into a more readable and sort of searchable form. And then I went looking for anything else I could find about the HLI and the Battle of Buron, and there wasn't much, which made me want to kind of do the book more, you know, because I thought it was a story that, you know, should be known, you know, a little more widely. There was this book, which came out in the 80s, which is very good, but is now out of print, but wasn't from a very big publisher, didn't sell a lot of copies. It seemed like most people who owned the book were veterans of the battle itself. In fact, the copy I had was my grandfather's. I got it off his shelf when we were doing the big house clean-out I talked about. And, but it's a very good, you know, detailed description of a single battle, and I learned a lot from it. If you're at all interested in history, you know, try to track a copy down if you can. That led me to the Cambridge Armouries, which was the headquarters of the HLI. And fortunately is not far from where I live now in Waterloo, Ontario. Took a couple of phone calls to get them to let me in there, but when I did, it was really helpful. They have a really nice regimental museum where I was able to see, you know, they had the uniforms from the period. They let me kind of hold and photograph weapons, you know, from the 40s, you know, the weapons they would have used, which is really important because, you know, I had to draw it hundreds of times, you know, those things. More importantly, they had the official war diary for the regiment, which had detailed descriptions of everything the regiment had ever done every day for as long as there had been a regiment, which goes back to before even the First World War. You know, back over 100 years this regiment's been around. So there's these great big hardbound books, you know, a whole big row, giant shelf of them, and you take it down and there's a big one, you put it on the table, and you'll find the date you're looking for. And it's pretty cool, but they had, you know, so much detail. Like in the book, if it's April 4th, 1944, and I show it raining, I know that it was raining that day, because there's even weather reports in the war diary. There's everything you can imagine. While I was there, the first night I was there to take a look at the war diary, completely by coincidence, this man walked in, okay? He has unfortunately passed away now, nearly 2 years ago, but his name was Colonel Doug Barry. And he had also been a lieutenant and platoon commander with the HLI during the Second World War, and had been a good friend of my grandfather's and Jack's. Okay, just completely by coincidence this happens. He walks in, he happens to be returning a book he borrowed from the regimental library. Someone has the good sense to ask him, hey, did you know Scott Chantler? And he said, yeah, we were friends. And they said, well, we've got his grandson up in the officer's mess. So we were introduced, and we talked for about 3 hours, or at least he talked, and I scribbled notes as fast as I could. And this was great because I was getting a lot of, you know, just kind of dry information out of the war diary and out of books and stuff. But so many times I wished my grandfather was still around to ask him questions about, you know, how did this feel to be here? Or maybe there were two pieces of information that didn't quite make sense, how they would go together, and, you know, it would be nice to just ask him. Well, this is the role that Colonel Barry ended up playing. It was almost like, I describe it as like having my grandfather's ghost in the room. You know, just to be able to ask questions like that. And that was really, really helpful and really important to the book. I had about 25 pages written before I met Colonel Barry, and after that night, you can ask my wife, I went home and I threw those first 25 pages away and started again. That's how much he changed the direction of the book. And just for comparison, that's Doug Barry in 1943. So I was finding out more than I ever imagined I would be able to find out. I couldn't believe how much information there was out there, you know, if you were willing to dig a little bit. But one thing I didn't know much about was Jack Chrysler, okay, my grandfather's friend. I knew that he had been my grandfather's friend. I had his obituary, and I had 3 photographs of him, and that was it. From the obituary, though, I learned something I didn't know, which was that he had married an English girl in March 1944, just about 6 weeks before D-Day. And because of the war diary, I knew the date of their wedding. Because in those days, if you were an officer in the military, you had to get the military's permission to get married. So it was actually in there that he had gotten married. So, you know, I looked for stuff I could find on Jack. I found his death certificate, and it didn't really tell me much of anything. I went looking for what I could find then about his wife. And I got on, you know, I got on the web, I searched public records, I got on Ancestry.uk and, you know, see if I could find her in somebody's family tree or whatever. Nothing worked. I found a couple of references to Winifred Davison's, but there was no way to tell if it was the Winifred Davison I was looking for. A comics writer friend of mine named Anthony Johnston suggested, you know, a couple of websites in the UK where I could post information, you know, missing people, you know, people search kind of websites. So you can see here I've made a post, you know, this is a long shot, but I'm going to post it anyway. And I just said what I knew about her. And I wasn't expecting anything to come from it. And nothing did for quite a while. And I went ahead and I wrote the first draft of the book. And it was about 9 months later, I'd finished the first draft, turned it in, the folks at McClellan and Stewart were, you know, making their notes, and, you know, it was being passed around the editors' desks and whatnot. My email goes off, and it's the daughter of Winifred Davison. Her husband had been searching for, you know, her mother online for, you know, some research they were doing about their family history, had come across my post, and decided to get a hold of me, which was very cool because it turned out that in the same way that I had a lot of my grandfather's stuff from the war era, turned out that Winifred's daughter had a lot of her mom's stuff from the war era. So there was a big exchange of information that happened. I sent her everything I had, she sent me everything she had, and she had some very cool stuff. Such as more pictures, okay? Which was really important because, you know, because I work in a graphic form, I was going to have to draw Jack hundreds of times. So those 3 photographs I started out with just really weren't enough. I really needed more visual reference. What was interesting about these pictures of him is that he has a mustache. And in none of the 3 pictures I have did he have this mustache. So because my book is nonfiction and I got to account for all the, you know, all the research, you know, I had to rewrite a scene of the book to have, you know, show that he's growing a mustache. You know, he doesn't start the book with it, but he ends the book with it. And it was also important, you know, that I know what Winifred looked like, because of course I wanted to talk about the fact that he got married when he was there, and I was going to need to draw her. On a more basic level, though, I mean, it let me get to know Jack a little better. My first instinct, when I wrote that first draft that I talked about, before I really knew much about Jack, I'd sort of invented this character that was, you know, because when you're a writer, you're always looking for contrasts, and because my grandfather, as I've said, was a more quiet, sort of reserved man, my instinct was to make Jack a bit more of a gregarious, sort of funny character. Turns out my instincts on that were, you know, pretty close to correct. You know, you can tell from these photos, you know, everyone's happy on their wedding day, at least you would hope so. But, you know, you can tell, you know, they're a really fun couple, and he seems like a really fun guy. And something else they had, you know, along those lines that was even more important was almost daily letters that Jack had written to her mom from the front, okay, from France, from where the fighting was going on. And this was really important because, again, it let me get to know Jack a little more, and also because I'd started with that diary of my grandfather's, right? But it was only 1943, so it ended at the end of 1943. Well, these letters take over in early 1944, just after he meets Winifred. So, between the two, I had either my grandfather's or Jack's personal take on everything that happened. And the book, you know, I don't know if anyone here has actually read the book or not, but it's divided into 2 halves. There's you know, an English half and a French half, a training half and a combat half. One's my grandfather's point of view, one's Jack's. So 2 halves, 2 generals, 2 narrators. The whole thing had a kind of a nice symmetry to it that I really liked. It ended up being really important to the book. This letter is really interesting for a couple of reasons. When I was putting this presentation together the first time, my wife was reading this over my shoulder, and she was quite charmed by it. You know, Jack was a very charming guy, and this is him writing to, you know, his new bride, so he's really laying it on pretty thick here. Then I pointed out the date to her, July 7th, 1944, and she started to cry a little bit. because she knows as well as I do that Jack was killed the very next morning in the Battle of Juron. So this is actually Jack's last letter to his wife or to anyone, okay? So that's why I showed this one and not one of the, dozens of others.